The views expressed are not those of local community broadcasting, WYML LP, or its management, volunteers, or underwriters. Greetings and welcome to the Personal Safety Show. This is Marcus Melnick from Stress2Logic, your host. Today we have Dr. Dan Franz, who works in the mental health area, to be interviewed. Dan, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to our listeners. Can you start by telling everyone what your origin story is?
Absolutely. So my origin story, I grew up in the steel industry of the Midwest, and after high school, it was either head off to college or join the steel business. And not many people were going to college. I actually had to ask my dad this question just a few years ago. I'm like, hey, I wasn't the brightest student. Why did you think it was a good idea for me to go to college? And he said, well, everybody else was doing it. And, well, we just didn't think you'd be really good in steel. So I headed off to college, studied psychology. I loved college so much. I'd like to say it was the best 9 or 10 years of my life. I got out of there with 2 pieces of paper that I spent time studying and a wife. So I think that was a win. And from there, I went into, I had a degree, a master's degree in counseling psychology. And I really through college, I worked in adolescent treatment, right? As a psychology student, I wanted to find a job in the industry. And I was helping adolescents behind adolescent offenders, we called them back then. They may have been known as juvenile delinquents back in a previous day. Adolescent offenders behind a 12-foot fence. So we got some of the more difficult ones. And from there, I went on to work in the adolescent substance abuse industry, directing, guiding, leading an organization in Indianapolis, Detroit, Cincinnati, and eventually in the Chicagoland area. I moved on from there. Clinical leadership it wasn't quite my thing. I enjoyed it. But I really liked being on the front lines helping people. So I opened up a practice here where we decided to settle and raise our girls. And now I've been in private practice for probably about 15 years. And it's been fun, right? Private practice allows me to help in a variety of different ways during that time. I went on to get my doctorate in the psychology of meaning, or what we call logotherapy. So pretty diverse practice is kind of what I have.
So what's the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist?
Such a good question. I get to spell this out often. So a psychologist, we go to school and for 4 or 5 or a few years in my case, study psychology and get a bachelor's degree. And maybe go on to get a 2-year master's degree in something like counseling psychology or clinical psychology. And then there's 4 more years of study for your doctorate. Usually write a big fancy paper called a dissertation. You do some internship. So we go the academic route. Psychiatrists, on the other hand, these are medical professionals. These are physicians, medical doctors, who go on to specialize in the field of psychiatry. 100 years ago, in the days of Freud and my favorite guy, Dr. Viktor Frankl, psychiatrists actually did a lot of counseling. Today, counseling is mostly in the realm of us psychologists, and psychiatrists really specialize, because they're medical doctors, they specialize in the writing of prescriptions for different mental illnesses and psychological problems.
Very good. Thank you for explaining that. So you talked about being behind a 12-foot fence. Was this a permanent, well, that's not the right word. Was this a lockup, or was this just happens to be a group home? What was the facility that you started out in?
So this was the Youth Opportunity Center in Muncie, Indiana. When I started there, it really is a beautiful model for helping youth and adolescents. And because it was so close to Ball State University, what we like to call the Harvard of Muncie, it really attracted a lot of college students in psychology to work there. So it was a 10-cottage campus when I first started there. So 10 structures that housed children and adolescents of different ages, genders, and then issues, right? So we had a couple of emergency cottages for kids needing short-term placement. There was, unfortunately, sadly, a kind of like a little boys cottage where, 4 and 5 and 6 up to 10 years old would receive treatment for an extended period of time. And this was all situated around a large administrative / school / gymnasium building. And so the kids would have school there during the day. And in the evening, people of my category or profession, we were responsible for kind of the daily programming of the adolescents. So in my cottage, famous cottage number 8, we were behind, these were young men who had committed some juvenile offenses, maybe, frequent breaking and entering or some physical violence, things like that, obviously coming from difficult home situations. And my responsibility was to kind of help teach them different ways of dealing with life and coping and get them through the after school into the evening in a structured sort of way.
What comes to mind is, and there might be a different term for it. One of the police departments I worked for had, I believe it was called like the Gentleman Program. And what it did was it took youth, not necessarily troubled youth, but troubled youth were certainly involved. And it taught them how to shake hands, how to tie a tie, how to have manners. Is that the type of thing that you focused on?
Similar. We did a lot of that, but these were court-ordered youth that had committed some kind of offense and were already in the criminal justice system. At least in all the cottages, each one, the kids were court-ordered in some way. And for some period of time, sometimes, again, it was just a rescue. Rescue was an emergency, maybe a week or two while temporary housing was found or a foster family, or maybe the family of origin was rehabilitated. The young men I worked with, again, slightly more criminal offenses, probably drug-related, violence-related. And so our goal was to help them achieve some form of rehabilitation, reunification with family, things like that. So, yeah, we certainly did teach eye contact and conversation skills and handshaking, but also a little bit beyond that as well. Sometimes they were in there for an extended stay of 6 to 12 months.
Okay, very good. Can you talk about some of the success stories that you've interacted with?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, from the Youth Opportunity Center, I don't have a lot of continued contact there. Ironically, one of the gentlemen I worked with, we were partners in this field, left early on and moved away to this small town. I said, well, wherever that is in Indiana, good luck. Good knowing you. It was a pleasure. And wouldn't you know it, a few years later, I started dating a young lady from there who eventually became my wife. And now we live just down the road from each other. So we kind of keep in touch with some of the people we used to work with. We hear some of those stories. Some of my greatest success stories came from the second evolution, working in adolescent substance abuse treatment. I was there in that field at the start of social media. And so as these young people matured into adulthood, some of them opted to keep in touch with me, and I still keep in touch with some of them today, nearly 20 years later. And so I get to hear some of those success stories of young people leaving behind substance use and abuse and addiction, going out into the world, marrying, having families, having great jobs and things like that. So it's been awesome to hear some of those stories. I actually, ironically, just spoke to one this morning who's kind of seeking some guidance here and there. A young man I worked with literally 22 years ago. He was a young man then. He's in his late 30s now, and has a lovely family and a wife and a great business in part of our state. And it's just good to hear those kind of stories. Of course, there's the other side of the story too when it comes to addiction of young people that didn't make changes, and who we may have lost.
Right. And so what sort of issues do families struggle with when one of their children or family members is, and I'm making air quotes with my fingers, troubled? And when I say troubled, what I mean is not necessarily criminal, although that's part of it, but what I mean is specifically with behavioral issues, especially in the teenage years, behavioral issues, inappropriate dealings, as well as mental illness. What sort of troubles do these families go through?
Right now, we are in some really difficult times with our adolescents, with social media and what they're exposed to in their on their smartphones and laptops. It seems to be some pretty difficult times. What I've experienced is young people getting into, in my state, Indiana, is surrounded by states with legal marijuana.
Right.
We're not legal yet. And so some enterprising young people that I work with drive to the state next door, spend some of mom and dad's money to acquire cannabis in its various forms and bring it back and have a thriving entrepreneurial business. But that's not legal and not healthy, and really gives them a sad dose of illegal money in the allure of it. So that's one kind of problem. I think all of the difficulties that come with social media, these expectations. I just recently, I think it was last week, I had a young person say, well, I think I'm going to try this Ozempic
Yes.
injection. I said, what isn't that? Of course, I'd heard the commercial and I can almost sing the jingle, but I have no idea what it's for. And so I looked it up, and it's a diabetes drug, but not as it's meant for diabetes. But people in the social media spheres, celebrities, are using it as a weight loss drug.
Right.
And now we have young people saying, well, I haven't fully matured into puberty yet, and I feel I'm a little chunky, so give me this injection that lasts several months. And even celebrities are saying, like, they reach these abysmal weights where they look almost gaunt. And because it's an injection, you just can't stop it. So the exposure to social media is sometimes a frightening thing. We see bullying, which 20 or 30 years ago just meant pushing somebody around on the playground. Now it is actual psychological abuse, near psychological warfare over the internet waves. There's some difficult things family are seeing in youth lately.
Now, my mother always told me that you're never too rich or too thin. And that's a joke. I'm kidding. I'm not. It's not a serious comment.
Sure.
And you're gonna get jokes throughout. As someone who has lost 120 pounds, not on Ozempic, I'm very familiar with Ozempic, and I'm diabetic, so it definitely was an option. I did not opt for it, and I totally understand the whole social media thing, and I'll call it fat shaming because I still perceive myself as being heavy, although other people, whenever they see me, they're like, oh my God, you look so great. Yeah, that's because your mental image of me is I'm heavy. And then they think about it. They're like, oh yeah, okay, I've known you for 20 years. You were heavy and now you're not. So I totally get the whole social struggle. I don't care if, my mother always told me, I'll love you no matter what you weigh. So it doesn't matter to me. So we talked about family struggles and how you kind of segued into this, which is perfect. How do we keep our youth from substance abuse? And I'm not talking about I'm going to try a joint once in my life, to regular use of cannabis and other drugs as well. How do we keep our youth from entering into a world of substance abuse?
Just this week, I'm sitting in a meeting of the local drug-free coalition, right? So this is in the state of Indiana. Every county has a coalition that is part of the Governor's Commission for a Drug-Free Indiana, right? So each county has one of these, and we are charged with trying to solve just that problem in youth and adults in our community. And I'm sitting there with other psychologists and treatment providers, school officials, law enforcement. The sheriff was there, the coroner was there, hospital representatives, stop smoking representatives. And that was the exact question we were asking. We had actually just last year had spent money to hire a social media marketing guru to kind of help get the word out there. And we were talking about the benefits there. And what we find is these kids run into it many times because mom and dad have it. And if mom and dad have it and condone it, it is really hard for somebody like me coming from out of nowhere to say, well, this isn't really good for you and it interferes with brain development. There's a reason we don't allow kids to use this kind of stuff until they're 21, because we want you to develop fully with that brain. It's hard. So, the answer, a multifaceted approach, keeping kids involved. One of my easiest answers, keep young people involved in high school sports, in league sports, pickup sports, friendships, community, family, regular game nights, movie nights, family dinners, things like that. Keeping them involved in healthy activities is one of the best ways to prevent them from engaging in substance use and abuse. One of the things I hear the most I run a men's substance abuse group. Now, I did this very successfully live in my area for about 3 years and realized I could only approach so many people. So I just last month, just the beginning of this month, my goodness, wrote up the manual and took it online. And I have about a dozen right now, men working in this program. And one of them is just turned 19 last week. We celebrated his birthday virtually. And, where I have 40 and 50-year-old men talking about, well, I got pulled over for a DUI or an OWI. This shining, bright 18-year-old says, well, I got started with heroin and cocaine, and then that progressed to crack and meth. And we're just sitting there going, oh my goodness, how did this happen? And Marcus's answer was, I was just bored. And I almost fell out of my chair. I said, my goodness, in the world we live in right now, how can anybody be bored? But he was, because he didn't have that kind of involvement. He didn't have people encouraging him, sometimes even pushing him. I know I've had to push my own daughters to stay involved in sports and activities. But research will tell us keeping kids involved, doing healthy things, athletics, teams, competitions, clubs, connection besides just on their phone, can and will prevent them from engaging in something. They might try something, but it will prevent them from becoming regular abusive users.
One of the things I do with my family, and I'm in a blended family, and so we each have children from two other parents, and there's a visitation schedule. And my thing was, look, everyone's running in a million directions, including me, including my wife, including each of the teenage children, with work and school and activities. And I want to have dinner with them once a week or once every other week. How does, I've always said that's awesome. We should all get together regularly. When I was a kid, it was every night, but the world is a little different now. So what advice would you give to parents whose now their teenage children are running in all these directions? How do parents reconnect with their teenagers?
Back in the good old days, Marcus, right? It was the same thing growing up. Like, we all gathered around the family table. Now, of course, Dad had to pull the TV in its giant 8,000-pound TV cart around so that we could watch the news during dinner. But at least we were all there, right? And now we were allowed to speak during the commercials when he wasn't saying, shh, I want to hear what's going on here. But we were there. And now, because everybody is so busy and so involved, it is kind of hard. So there's a balance to be had there. How can parents reconnect? If you can't get everybody together for dinner once a week or every other week, individual one-on-one time, that drive time back and forth to sports is so important. Just so that, hey, how you doing? How was school today? I tell parents this all the time. Be curious. Try to see what's going on in your child's life. Understand their perspective. Without, one of our worst qualities as parents is, we've experienced a lot, and sometimes we tend to want to pontificate or provide too much guidance too soon. And I'm sure Marcus, what's the value of free advice? Well, it's free, and so nobody really pays attention to it. But when kids come to it, when we open those lines of communication, when we have conversations, maybe we're not having dinner around the table. Maybe it's going to Chick-fil-A or, the local diner and sitting down and saying, I know for us, when we were crazy busy, I was coaching both girls in soccer. Somehow my wife escaped that and got to stay home. I still haven't figured that out. But we would meet up at Subway, right? I mean, we'd have school. I would be done with work. We'd go to soccer practice, and it was like, nobody's cooking. Let's just sit down at Subway and have a sandwich, right? Spending time together in whatever way you can and cherishing it. I know sometimes when it's all teenagers all day long, for me, I'm not saying other parents would do this, but, I often thought, my goodness, I can't wait until you're up and into, something else and, more autonomous and on your own. And now I miss those days. And I recognize, like, those are days to be cherished. Like, they're hard. But I tell you what, you better enjoy them now, because once college hits, it's a different kind of hard because they're not there as much.
And that's exactly what I'm going through right now. I have one who's out of the house. I have another who's going to Alabama next year. And I've got my stepson is going into his junior year next year. So I'm not too far away from that. And I, just to dovetail on it, I sorely miss the days when my children were young. Actually, I have a tear in my eye when I look at old videos. Like, oh my God, that was such an awesome time. And sometimes parents, they have stressors they don't realize, and myself included, how precious that time is. So I'm going to segue a little bit. Your website talks about mental health and meaning. What does it actually mean?
I've studied and practiced helping people improve their mental health for, my goodness, almost 30 years now, at least 25. And meaning is something, the psychology of meaning, I just wrapped up a degree in, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago. I was just sitting here out on the porch reading Dr. Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Man's Search for Meaning is one of the top 10 most gifted books of the past 100 years, but somehow many people in the U.S. haven't read it. And I tell you, it's an easy read. It's maybe 120 pages, and most people who read it will tell you it's absolutely life-changing. And it certainly was for me. The psychology of meaning, logotherapy, coming from the Greek logos, or meaning, is about 100 years old. But in the U.S., we don't get much training in it because it's a very European idea that we are all on this pursuit of meaning. And when we feel that pursuit of meaning being interrupted or there are obstacles in the way, we often find ourselves suffering. We see anxiety, depression, mental health issues, but not what I would consider to be mental illness, but just this kind of malaise, this kind of general feeling. And when we can define it, when we say, hey, man, you're looking for meaning and you don't have any. And we live in a world that really prevents us from seeking meaning sometimes, right? A world that constantly tells us, you got to buy this, you got to get the latest iPhone, newest laptop, biggest TV, most recent edition of the vehicle you're already driving. We go on this consumer-driven cycle versus actually finding true meaning in our lives. And so what I've been doing for probably about the past 10 years in my practice is really helping people understand that, looking at this idea that you don't have to be on an antidepressant or an anti-anxiety pill. We got to help you find some meaning in your life. And wouldn't you know it, the desire to drink excessively or smoke marijuana every day or other substances or that need for a pill to feel better every day eventually goes away when you have something that you're excited about in life.
What's the difference between coaching and counseling?
Very simply, counseling is, I get to use your insurance and we talk, I'll do my terrible Freud accent. We talk about your mother, your father, no. We go a little deeper in counseling, right? We talk about maybe trauma or mental illness. Coaching is more forward focused and goal oriented. It's about the here and now. And we really don't deal so much with mom and dad or family of origin. We can if needed. In my practice, they can be intermingled. Now, when it comes from an education perspective, counselors, psychotherapists, psychologists, we go through some really extensive education, practice, internships, licensure, testing to get to that point. So, if you're speaking to a counselor and maybe it's their day one in the office, they've been through years of education and supervision and testing. A coach these days, really, anybody gets to call themselves a coach. If you went through a difficult time in life, you get to be a coach and talk to people about that difficult time in life. There are some training programs. There's more certification and education now. So it's becoming more regimented. But there's just different ways, different education and different approaches.
So how is mental illness linked to psychological trauma?
Sometimes they go hand in hand. We're just now really doing good research. We were developing new tools, brain mapping tools, functional MRIs to understand the human brain and what trauma does to it. I think the last study I read, it estimated 70 to 80% of us go through some kind of trauma in life. Now, I like to differentiate between big T trauma, right? That trauma that you feel your life is threatened, maybe from natural disaster, physical assault, being around some kind of terrorist attack like the Boston bombings, or little T trauma. And all of us, I would say everybody in the world experienced a combination of little T traumas during the COVID lockdown time and all of those months where we didn't know what the future held. We all experienced little T traumas throughout our lives that can eventually build up and lead to depression, anxiety, different kinds of diagnoses. Whereas big T trauma, we know that generates PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, that has a very defined sense of symptoms. So I would say they certainly go hand in hand. You do not have to have experienced trauma to have a mental illness. But if you have experienced trauma, there's a really good chance you're struggling with some kind of mental health concern.
And are mental health concerns, can they be temporary or are they with you your entire life?
I would like to think that's a good question.
Or
I would
both.
like to think they exist, but they can be mitigated. Do you always have to be depressed? Absolutely not. You can gain control of it. You can learn how to manage it, but there are chances it can come back. But the great thing is, if you develop the tools to deal with a mental illness or a mental health issue like anxiety or depression or PTSD, if it comes back, you have the tools to deal with it.
There's another part of your practice that I'd love for you to touch on, and that's the
Myers-Briggs and the DISC survey and career assessments. Can you talk about some of the work that you've done in those areas?
Yes. I love the Myers-Briggs type indicator. I've been using it, since I was in grad school. We kind of get permission to use it, but then I went and got even further certified in it. It is a wonderful assessment of what we call personality preferences. It is not your personality. It doesn't talk about whether or not you're psychologically sound or unstable, but it talks about your preferences towards introversion and extroversion, towards thinking and feeling, the way you approach the world, the way you approach relationships, and of course, that also means the way you approach career. And so I love the MBTI for people first to gain some self-understanding, but then, let's see, the MBTI has been used since around the World War II era. I think it was kind of generated in response to needing to classify people for job duties during World War II. And we've only gotten better and more scientific with it since then. And so now we have access to national data on job satisfaction, where we can compare personality preferences, whether you're more introverted or extroverted, whether you're more sensing or intuitive, and compare that to other people's preferences and their job satisfaction. So we take your results and we can compare them to people with this are 100. There's 100 out of 100 people are satisfied in this job industry. And I just love using that report. I get access to such robust data with the MBTI. And people often review this and they go, wow, that totally is me, but it's a new way to understand myself. So I love using the MBTI.
When we return, we will continue the conversation with Dr. Franz, and we'll also hear from David Doughty, who works in a similar space but with incarcerated individuals. Stay tuned. The views expressed are not those of local community broadcasting, WYML LP, or its management, volunteers, or underwriters.